All set. When you're ready, I'll let them in.
Got it. Thank you. Good morning, folks. We'll get started in just one moment here. Okay, good morning and welcome back to docket number 210515 REO1, the reopener focused on revenue adjustment mechanisms for performance-based regulation framework. We are here for technical meeting number 7, and we have an agenda in front of us this morning with presentations from Eversource and the United Illuminating Companies. So we will proceed in accordance with that agenda. We have time after each presentation for Pura staff questions. If there are time for other stakeholder questions, we will provide for that. If not, we do have a block of time at the end of the agenda for more open discussion. So as a general reminder of housekeeping matters, we do have a court reporter with us today, so we ask that you please avoid using the chat function, as that is not part of the record. If you have a question or comment, we'll ask you to verbalize that at the appropriate part of the agenda today. When you do speak, please make sure you're identifiable by name and affiliation for clarity of our record. With that, I think those are the only opening remarks that we need to offer. We'll transition into Eversource's presentation up first, and I see Mr. Horton, so if you can just start off by letting us know if you'd like Ms. Lupley to control the presentation, and after that, the floor is yours, sir.
Great, good morning, thank you. That would be great, Ms. Lupley, if you could control the presentation. We have a handful of slides, and then I know today is to focus on the financial analysis, so our thought and how that would work is we'll talk through the slides, and then we can bring up and we could share the analysis if that's depending on the questions, if that's helpful. And just so folks know, so I'm joined in the room with me today by Garrett Murray. So if I'm leaning over to speak, it's with him. All right, so we can move on to the next slide. I'll start. I have a few slides, like I said, on some of the major flaws that we see with the framework. And then Lynn Trinidad from LEI will talk about some of the foundational principles that we see as being necessary for a successful PBR regime. And then, like I said, we can talk about the financial analysis. But before I go through the slides, I just wanted to reiterate, and I've said this multiple times, and truly believe that at the outset, we support PBR and are hopeful that through this process, we'll reach a balanced outcome that will properly weigh customer rate impact considerations with the funding levels that are necessary for us so that we can achieve the outcome desired at PBR. I'll talk about some of the major concerns that we have, but I would say they boil down into two fundamental premises that we're abiding by as we evaluate the PBR framework put out by Pura. So first, that we're starting with the premise that our rates must be set at a level that provides us with a reasonable opportunity, and to be clear, not a guarantee, but a reasonable opportunity for us to recover our operating costs, including costs of ongoing investments, and the cost of the capital that is needed for us to attract that capital in order to finance those investments. We operate in a highly competitive market for capital, and we don't get to tell our investors what return they require in order to give us their capital. So our concerns that I'll walk through are really just that the shortcomings of the straw proposal will cause us to find ourselves in a framework that's insufficient for us to attract that capital necessary for us to serve our customers and for us to be able to make the operational changes and investments in people, processes, and technology that will be required of us in order to achieve the desired outcomes of PBR. And we'll talk about this in my slides, but if a utilities rates are not set at a level that is designed to recover its costs, including the cost of capital, we have only two options. One would be to stop spending in order to lower the level of expenditures and fit under the authorized level of revenues. Or the second option would be to file a rate case, which under the PBR framework is contemplated that we would not be doing so that we can retain the benefits of PBR. And number two, although it's related to the first, it is different. that PBR represents a shift away from cost of service rate making, not a departure from our cost of service, meaning that the framework under PBR is a shift from a framework where we have frequent sequential rate cases. And instead, there's an expectation that the utility will be able to avoid filing rate cases sequentially and have the incentives by not being able to file sequential rate cases to find efficiencies and to make those investments that ultimately benefit our customers. So those fundamental underpinnings are what drives our concern with the PBR straw proposal, because there are foundational principles that are not retained in the straw proposal as it's written. As designed, we would not have an opportunity to recover our costs. We would be behind right out of the gate, and we would never catch up under the PBR framework as put out. And even a perfectly run utility would fail in this model. So we would never be able to commit to a stay out. We would never be able to make the incremental investments in people, processes, or technology to achieve the desired goals of PBR. And the analysis that we presented was intended to show that with the limitations outlined in the straw proposal, our returns would never approach the authorized levels, which again would leave us with only two options: to either stop spending or to file rate cases in order to bring up our level of revenues in order to attract the capital that we need to run the system and to maintain the desired outcomes of PBR. And I will just note too, I did review UI's presentation. I know they'll be up later, but we generally are aligned on all of the concerns that we have. And so it's depending on the process and how, Pierre, if you would like to address it, Chairman, we certainly I would welcome their input in the Q&A portion, at least to those things that are overlapping. So with that as our backdrop, I can jump into some of the major concerns that we have. So number one is that PURA's framework would eliminate post-test year adjustments. By doing so would mean that as at the initial starting point of PBR, our rates would be set at a level that is already stale. When we use a historical test year, it's a representative level. The framework contemplates that only downward adjustments would be made to that historical level. There would be no post-test year adjustments to get us up to a rate year level of spending, which would be a non-starter for us. Like I said, if we are not able to have rates that align with our costs in any given year, we have two simple options. We stop spending, meaning we lower our cost structure in order to fit under that level of revenues, or we would file a rate case and demonstrate that a revenue increase is needed, a rate increase is needed, so that we can have an opportunity, but not a guarantee, to earn our authorized ROE. By outright eliminating post-test year adjustments, we would not have that opportunity. We can go on to the next one. There's no notion of capital cost recovery within the framework. The amount of plant that would be allowed in rates for the going cast off rates or going in rates would be set at a fixed period that is historical. And there would be no accompanying mechanism for capital cost recovery that would provide for us to make up any gap, despite the fact that the ongoing investments in the system are most certainly increasing over time and would not be reflected in either the historical level of investment or in the absence of an accompanying mechanism. So that would be a severe detriment that would not allow us to make the necessary investments that would be envisioned in order to achieve the objectives of PBR and to avoid a rate case for any amount of time. Number three, the PBR, or excuse me, the framework established by the straw proposal declines to adopt an X factor, despite industry trends that would suggest that our costs don't trend, utilities costs don't track with the rate of inflation, or any analysis to suggest that that would be sufficient for us to avoid a rate case or to make those ongoing investments. Where the X factor is designed, and I know it can be controversial, the intent of it is not. The intent of the development of an X factor, and Ellie, I can speak to this more so than I, but the intent of the X factor is to establish a relationship between the utilities costs with inflation. And so that relationship has been proven to be a negative, which does not imply that utilities are not efficient. It simply says that the average utility cost trend increases at a rate greater than inflation, which results in a negative X factor. And by denying a negative X factor or any X factor out of the gate, again, without an accompanying capital cost recovery mechanism or some other framework in place, it will simply be insufficient and utilities would not be able to operate under that paradigm. So that is another fatal flaw that we see out of the gate. We can move on to the next slide. It also, the straw proposal adopts an altered approach for setting the level of depreciation in rates. So while it does allow for rates or rate base to be updated as a set point in time, it then says that instead of having depreciation rates be set or depreciation expense be set to reflect even that point in time, it instead opts for a 13-month historical average for depreciation expense, which does not align with the costs that we would be incurring in the rate year, not only for the reasons I've said prior, but on its own would be right out of the gate a deficiency that would have us have rates that don't reflect our costs in any given year, including the first year that rates are set. The straw proposal does contemplate having an I factor, meaning that for rate year 2 and beyond, our rates would change based on inflation. Number one concern, as I previously mentioned, was there is not necessarily a tie based on the straw proposal to our annual cost change relative to inflation. And historically and recently, that cost trend has shown that utilities costs increase greater than inflation. But putting that aside, even if there were analysis to suggest that inflation was a good measure of our cost trend and a good proxy for the level that rates should change on an annual basis, by locking that rate in at the beginning of a plan, which under the framework is contemplated to be 4 years, is a misalignment because inflation can change and can vary. The straw proposal only would contemplate an update to that inflation factor if the inflation, the actual inflation, increased or decreased by 250 basis points over a 12 calendar month period, which is significant. So if you were to say, if say over a 4-year term, inflation were to increase 250 basis points or 300 basis points over the duration of that plan, the straw proposal wouldn't accommodate any change unless and only if that increase were to happen in 1 year. So by the end of a 4-year term, actual inflation could be 500 basis points or pick a number significantly greater than that which is allowed for in rates, but the framework wouldn't accommodate that unless that increase it happened over 1 month or 1 year, excuse me, of the 4-year term. My point is simply that by locking it at the outset, it is ignoring the actual experience that the utilities would be operating under, which would not retain the incentives, the rate making incentives inherent in PBR. We can move to the next slide. And I mentioned this as well, but where there is at the outset a denial of a capital funding mechanism, working in conjunction with the other concerns that we've outlined, would not provide for a level of revenues that would allow us to avoid a rate case and to stay out of a rate case, because we will be spending levels of capital and incurring costs associated with O&M that would be severely deficient relative to what would be allowed for in the rate making construct envisioned in the straw proposal. We can move to the next slide. So taken together, again, our concern is simply that while the straw proposal is clearly intended to set rates or to control rate changes for customers, it is missing a half of the equation, which is to ensure that the rates that are set for our customers are aligned with our costs and the costs of serving our customers. And the reality is simply, like I said, when any company is faced with that predicament, meaning its costs are in excess of its revenues, it can either cut its costs or it can try to increase its revenues. And if it's not able to cover its costs of doing business in its revenues, then that business would not be able to stay in business. If a business's cost of doing business is greater than the amount of revenues it is able to collect for doing business, that business is not a viable business. So I just don't see any way around the fact that we need to have a framework in place that has our rates reflecting our costs. And we can do that while still moving towards the spirit of PBR, certainly, and moving away from a framework that is a cost of service rate making framework and a performance-based rate making framework. But we just simply can't do that if it is blindly setting rates below the level of our costs. And we can move to the next slide. So we can pull up our financial analysis at the end, like I said, but the analysis that we had submitted with our written comments was intended to show that if you were to backcast the from using our prior rate case cost of service. If we were to not have the results be what was actually experienced as a result of that settlement agreement, but were to instead impose the restrictions that I've just discussed and are outlined in the straw proposal, what would the reality have looked like? And we demonstrated that right out of the gate, our earned return would have been 75 basis points below that which we were able to earn under the prior framework, and it would steadily plummet over the term of the PBR framework when we backcast it. So we'd be under earning by more than 200 basis points by the end. And I say that to say, again, when a company isn't earning its authorized ROE, it has two options. It can stop spending money, or it can file a rate case. And the concern that we have, again, is simply that if we don't have an opportunity to cut costs, and we certainly wouldn't expect there to be an opportunity annually to cut costs again and again and again without impacting the service quality that we're providing to our customers, and certainly not in a regime where we are expected to be increasing that service in a whole host of other areas as envisioned by PBR, it would be destined to fail out of the gate. So we're hoping by this constructive feedback and through this process that we'll reach a framework that acknowledges things while still maintaining those incentives so that we are fully incentivized, and we think this is possible, to reduce our cost structure and benefit customers while still be achieving those additional incremental benefits and providing incremental service and value to our customers that's envisioned by PBR. So we'll revisit the analysis again in the Q&A if the questions come, but for now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague at LEI. Thank you. For the next slide. Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Doug. Good morning. I'm Sherilyn Trinidad, a director at London Economics International. LEI was retained by Eversource to assist in this docket and in the design of PBR in Connecticut. So today, I will begin my presentation by discussing some principles behind going-in rates, which is a very important step in the process of setting up a workable PBR framework. Next, I will cover best practices in conducting financial analysis that help inform the sustainability of a jurisdiction's proposed PBR design. Lastly, and if the chairman allows it, I will provide a high-level overview into the benefits of excluding PIMS from the calculation of the ESM, which is a relevant conversation to have in the context of today's focus on going-in rates and PBR financial analysis. And with that introduction, we can move on to the next slide, please. So at the onset of a PBR term, conducting a cost of service analysis is essential to establishing the going-in rates. It's crucial that these going-in rates accurately reflect the full cost, including ongoing and rate year operating and maintenance expenses associated with delivering distribution services capable of achieving the priority outcomes outlined in the PBR framework. It should also reflect the return on and return of capital related expenditure. Failing to do so would result in the need for a subsequent rate case to bring rates up to date, which would mean that the utility would not be able to stay out for the term of the PBR. It would also result in subsequent years of the PBR term being based on a revenue requirement that falls short of meeting the PBR objectives, again, not allowing the utilities to abide by the stay out associated with the choice of the PBR term. Getting the going-in rates correct by ensuring the rates are commensurate with the costs is critical to the success of the PBR plan. Setting going-in rates too low will compromise the utility's capacity to deliver services to customers effectively and to make investments that are essential for ensuring reliability, resilience, and alignment with policy objectives. On the other hand, going-in rates that are too high will not incentivize the cost efficiencies desired out of the utility. So during the PBR term, a utility's operating and capital costs can change due to different factors such as inflation, technological changes, market shifts, and regulatory requirements. At the end of the regulatory term and before the start of another PBR generation, costs are usually re-examined. So this review phase is called rebasing. So the goal of rebasing is to realign and then adjust the rates so that they accurately reflect what it costs to provide utility services for the rate year. During a rebasing, a utility's cost structure, revenue requirements, and certain parameters of the PBR plan are reviewed to ensure that they remain reflective of the cost of providing services. If a utility was successful in achieving efficiencies and found ways to save money during a PBR term, the new going-in rate set during rebasing should reflect these realized savings, which would benefit customers throughout the next generation PBR. So the table below in the slide provides examples of going-in rates used in jurisdictions that are under an I-X framework. The first key takeaway is that in all these jurisdictions, PBR begins with a cost of service-based analysis of what the going-in rates should be. They have different ways on how to calculate the going-in rates, either based on a historic test year with adjustments or based on forward test year. But what is the same across these jurisdictions is the recognition that going-in rates should be adequate for the utility to provide service to the customers and for the utility to earn the allowed rate of return. This is the second takeaway. Historic test year data are generally adjusted in some manner to make rates more relevant to the business conditions during the rate year. For instance, in Massachusetts, the base distribution rate filings are based on a historic test year and adjusted for known and measurable changes. So example of these approved known and measurable changes in the most recent NSTAR electric rate case include union wage increases, insurance credits, and insurance expense premiums, COVID-19 response costs, and transfer of solar expansion program capital investments into base distribution rates, to name a few. There are also jurisdictions in Canada that use forward or forecasted test year. In Ontario, for example, utilities are required to submit projected costs and revenues, as well as the number of customers and consumption for a test year, which is the first year of the PBR term. OEB, or the regulator in Ontario, will use this information to determine new distribution rates effective in the first year of the PBR term. The third takeaway that you can see from all these jurisdictions, except for Hawaii, since it's still their first PBR generation, is that they have rebasing or examination of the utilities cost to see if the utility has the opportunity to recover its cost of service are aligned with the rebasing to examine that the utility's opportunity to recover its cost of service are still aligned. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we'll be talking about a jurisdiction, which is in Hawaii, that perform their financial analysis. So throughout this proceeding, LEI has advocated for quantitative analysis that empirically support the choice of PBR components adopted for the PBR framework in Connecticut. LEI also proposes a quantitative exercise to test the financial implications of the proposed PBR design. We believe that this session aims to do that, but as I will discuss in the example of Hawaii, we need a more comprehensive discussion in this. A good example would be the financial analysis undertaken by stakeholders in Hawaii, where they tested 15 different combinations or scenarios of PBR components to understand the impacts of these scenarios on both the utilities and the customers. So in terms of process, 3 stakeholders undertook their own financial forecast modeling exercise using their own financial modeling tools. These 3 stakeholders were the utilities, Ulupono Initiative, and the consumer advocate. The utilities utilize a financial planning and budgeting software called the UI Planner that they had already been using to run their analysis. And they adjust inputs within the budgeting software and reporting on the resulting financial outputs. The remaining 2 stakeholders did not use the same software, so they undertook the financial analysis using resources they had. For example, Ulufono hired a consultant to develop an Excel-based financial model. The outputs resulting from these models were later compared against one another, and I will discuss this more in detail later. So the first key takeaway here is that there are different ways to carry out this modeling exercise using a variety of tools, including those that are proprietary as well as others that are Excel-based. Stakeholders also had the opportunity to study and deliberate in depth the assumptions, calculations, and logic applied in each model. This was especially important because stakeholders used different modeling tools for this exercise. This is the second key takeaway from the Hawaii experience, namely that this was a collaborative process amongst stakeholders. Based on the documents LEI reviewed, it seems like stakeholders worked together and offered feedback on the models and assumptions they used for this financial analysis. Stakeholders use this feedback to adjust their model's inputs or calculations or explain why some suggested adjustments to the model could not be made. In terms of inputs, and as shown on the left-hand side of the figure at the bottom of this slide, there were several variables that were modified for the purpose of comparing results. I will not discuss each input, but for illustrative purposes, we'll point out a few variables that were adjusted in the modeling exercise. For example, stakeholders modeled 3 different X factors, including 2 negative X factors based on X factor studies produced for the utilities, as well as an X factor equal to 0. There were also 2 scenarios modeled for O&M costs, inclusive of savings identified in utility management audits. All scenarios also assume additional CAPEX or CAPEX that may not be covered by the company's revenue adjustment mechanisms and other relief mechanisms that would be required to achieve some of the policy objectives. Also, the future test year rate case was also modeled under different scenarios. So these scenarios include different levels of additional rate increases beyond the 2% annual baseline increase for plan additions. So the third key takeaway here is that major PBR components like X factor, O&M, CAPEX in the test year were not prematurely decided prior to this analysis. There were also other variables that were held constant. So as shown in the funnel on the figure at the bottom of the slide. For illustrative purposes, I will only discuss a few. So stakeholders agreed that authorized ROE should remain at approved levels. This is because utility financial integrity and good credit rating standing were specific outcomes stakeholders sought from the transition to a PBR regime. Stakeholders also excluded rewards and penalties from the PIMs in the analysis because the magnitude of reward and/or penalties could not be estimated. Hence, they were analyzed separately from this financial modeling scenario. But it's important to note that in the case of Hawaii, most of the PIMs were structured to be rewards only or tracking only. So there was limited downside risk of PIMs to the utilities, at least for the first generation of PBR. Another important item for Hawaii in the modeling was the production simulation assumptions. We highlight this particular input because it is one that would not be applicable to the transmission distribution only utilities like the EDCs in Connecticut. So we are flagging this input as a segue to a fourth key takeaway, which is that the modeling needs to be jurisdiction and context specific and reflective of the conditions in the jurisdictions being modeled. So after the process, stakeholders presented the results of their analysis using the metrics shown on the right-hand side of the graphic. We can see that these metrics measure the financial and customer impacts of using different inputs to the PBR components. Results presented by the 3 stakeholders were also compared against each other. These results informed the design process in Hawaii and put into numerical context the paths available for Hawaii to achieve the objectives of implementing PBR. This was an extensive process that took several months, but one that would provide objective insight into the implications of adopting a PBR regime in the state. Next slide, please. Since today's tech session is more financial focused, we also wanted to say just a few words about the benefits of excluding PIMS, rewards, and penalties from the ESM calculation, which has come up in different stakeholder written comments submitted to the docket. So it seems that most stakeholders are in agreement on this issue, but we thought that it would be helpful to go over, since it's connected to the discussion on going in rates and financial analysis. More specifically, we need to think about all these PBR elements as a whole, and this issue of PIMS and the ESM is one part of this larger PBR calculus. So for us, we identified 4 advantages of excluding the PIMS to the ESM calculation. So the main purpose of PIMS is to incentivize the utility to improve its performance in terms of operational efficiency, service quality, and other key performance metrics by sharing the benefits and or penalties of PIMS with customers. The direct link between utility performance and incentives is weakened. Therefore, excluding the rewards and penalties from the ESM would maintain the incentive properties of the PIMS. Second, excluding the rewards and penalties from the ESM calculation will protect customers if the utility is underperforming. Customers do not have to bear part of the financial burden. Third, including PIMS rewards or penalties in earnings sharing adds complexity to the incentive structure and may make it less transparent for stakeholders. And finally, related to the third item, calculating the earnings and ROE becomes more straightforward if rewards and penalties are excluded. So we also provide 2 examples of jurisdictions that are currently doing this. These are Rhode Island and New York. So with that, this concludes my presentation.
Thank you both. We are going to start with questions from authority staff, and I believe Mr. Kramer has a couple questions to start us off.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Horton and Ms. Trinidad, for the presentation. I believe just one question from me at this point, which is for you, Ms. Trinidad, on LEI's slide number 2. The table refers to Hawaii and Massachusetts and the adjustments in CapEx and O&M. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate, please, on how those adjustments work specifically. And excuse me, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
So in Massachusetts, our understanding is that they're using a historic test year. And
Lynn, I could talk about Massachusetts if you want, but
Okay,
maybe
yeah.
Hawaii, yeah.
yeah, Doc, you can go ahead if you want for Massachusetts. I can briefly describe Hawaii's.
Okay, yeah, just because I was the witness or one of them in Massachusetts, I am intimately familiar with it. So in Massachusetts, like Lynn said, we start with a historical test year, but then we roll it forward for rate base. We start with the historical test year. In the most recent iteration of our PBR plan, the Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts adopted what's called a K-bar. So first and foremost, the cast-off rates or the going-in rates are set based on a historical test year adjusted for known and measurable changes through the midpoint of the rate year. So our prior rate case was in 2022 for rates effective on January 1st of 2023. So rates went into effect January 1st, 2023, based on the result of the rate case analysis, which incorporates a test year starting point adjusted for known and measurable changes. Those known and measurable changes are for both capital and O&M, such that the idea is that rates are set 1/1/23 to reflect our costs or expected costs to be incurred in 2023. In that proceeding, we have proposed a performance-based rate making framework with a I minus X factor, which is in that initial proposal, the X factor based on a study was negative, meaning that the relationship to the average utilities cost trend as you look ahead would result in changes annually that are greater than inflation. Through the pendency of the proceeding, though, the department became interested in other approaches because of some of the considerations and concern raised in the straw proposal about a negative X factor. Ultimately, what was approved by the department was inflation without an X factor, but with what's called a K-bar adjustment, which is recognition of changes for capital investments, operating on a formulaic basis under the PBR framework. The idea being that, again, in each year of the PBR term, we have an opportunity, but not a guarantee, to earn our authorized ROE. So what happens now is, and we had our first PBR and K-bar adjustment on January 1st of 2024. Essentially what we do is we take our cast-off rates, which were set on rate year 2023. We then apply inflation to those cast-off rates on whatever the actual inflation was. It's not fixed going in. It's the actual inflation in any given year. And in addition to the inflation adjustment, we calculate a K-bar adjustment. The K-bar calculation can be complicated, but it is simply saying, based on historical levels of investment adjusted by inflation. So what would your historical level of investment be adjusted to the rate year by inflation? It calculates the revenue requirement that we would need in that rate year that is not provided for through the combination of base rates and the inflation adjustment. So the idea is that it says it provides an allowance for both operating expense changes annually and then capital expenditure changes annually. It's not a tracker, so it doesn't take our actual plant and service in any given year and provide us actual revenues associated with those actual investments. It says based on your historical level of investments and the deficiency of the revenues that are allowed, how much revenues do you need to provide a representative level of revenue support, essentially providing us with an incentive to try as best we can to operate under the level of revenues that would be set essentially at a historical level adjusted for inflation.
Mr. Horton, thank you. Can I repeat back to make sure I got that accurately?
Absolutely. Yes, definitely.
Thank you. So essentially, if I'm trying to simplify here, just looking at this table, right, thinking about the adjustments in CapEx, that would be the adjustments in CapEx would be the known and measurable that are permitted based on the historical test year. And then additionally, the K-bar mechanism added. And then for adjustments to O&M, that would be, again, known and measurable adjustments to the test year, plus the inflation factor.
That's right. Well, just to be clear, the going in rates, you have it correct. So it's historical plus known and measurable changes. Absolutely. The annual changes throughout the period are where the PBR and the K-bar kick in. So similar to what the straw proposal contemplates, but different in many material aspects like I just described, the PBR adjustment kicks in for rate year 2 and beyond in Massachusetts, the combination of PBR and K-bar. And it applies against the cast-off rates that are set for rate year 1, which is based on historical test year adjusted for known and measurable changes for both capital expenditures and operating expenditures, such that the idea is rate year 1 rates are set to reflect the expectation of rate year 1 costs adjusted for known and measurable changes relative to the test year.
Thank you. And go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I just was going to make sure that we also addressed Hawaii because you had that question, but if you have more follow-ups, I'm certainly happy.
Just one more follow-up on Massachusetts before we get to Hawaii. Has the Massachusetts DPUC or DPU, excuse me, indicated that the MRP design is expected to remain the same moving forward? Is this sort of the new path forward based on the most recent hearing, or I'm sorry, the most recent proceeding?
That's a great question. So PBR has been generally adopted across the EDCs and some LDCs in Massachusetts. The first iteration was in our electric rate case in 2017, I believe, and it has evolved. In that rate case, the initial framework was an I minus X with a negative X factor. And I believe the other utilities then, in their subsequent rate cases filed and had approved similar structures. So there's an ongoing rate case now for one of our sister utilities in Massachusetts that will, come out with whatever it comes out with. I think the department has strongly signaled its desire and support for performance-based rate making. And as part of our approval, it's a 5-year term, but there is an opportunity for that term to be extended. There's a midterm check-in, if you will, to identify whether or not that framework can remain in place both for us and for customers. But certainly in the order that authorized it, the expectation is that, for all the reasons that we've talked about for PBR, it's intended to be a framework that will exist over time. And then really it needs to be for the incentives to work. So long way of saying yes, although I think there will be additional evolutions of the design over time based on the circumstances presented by the utilities or presenting the utilities.
Thank you. I think that's all the follow-ups for Massachusetts from me at this point. So Ms. Trinidad, if you could elaborate on Hawaii, please. I'm sorry, I think you're muted again if you're,
Yeah, sorry.
thank you.
Sorry. So in Hawaii, the going in rates or the initial revenues are based on the existing allowed revenues during that time based on historic test year as of the last date before the PBR tariffs became effective. And they have approved adjustments to the target revenue. So for example, like I believe Hawaii's PBR started, I think, June 2021, and Hilco test year was 2020. So there were some adjustments to the O&M expenses that were made for the initial revenues during the PBR term. And then as similar to Massachusetts, the initial revenues will be adjusted based on the annual revenue adjustment formula, or the I-X, that were agreed during the PBR term. I don't know if that answers your question.
That answers my question. Just to repeat back for O&M, it sounds like the adjustments that are being referred to in the table here are effectively maybe the equivalent of known and measurable. I don't know if they use that language, but adjustments to O&M post historical test year. And I did not catch what adjustments the table is referring to with respect to CapEx.
So there are some CapEx programs that were also reflected into the initial revenues, but I have to look at their filing to provide specific examples of these CapEx. But they have adjustments done for both the CapEx and O&M in the initial revenues that were used for the PBR term. And we can get back to you on that if that helps.
If it may already be filed on the record, if it's not, it would be helpful to make sure that we have that reference as well for the CapEx adjustments to the going in rates, or to the historical test year that would lead to the going in rates. That would be helpful.
Sure, we can look into that.
Chairman, that's it from me.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. I see Attorney Wheel's hand up, so we can go to Attorney Wheel, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Tom Wheel for the Office of Consumer Counsel. I just had one, I think probably quick question. Ms. Trinidad's portion of the slideshow, you spent a little while discussing the use of the company's position with respect to the use of PIM rewards or penalties for the calculation of the earnings sharing mechanism. And my read of the straw proposal is that the authority, at least as of the straw proposal, is not considering incorporating PIM penalties or rewards in the ESM calculations. So I was just hoping to confirm that's also how the company's reading the straw proposal.
It is, yes.
Okay, so was the intent of that to just reiterate?
I'm sorry, Tom. Yes, I think there were some questions. It's a great point. I think there were some questions whether it was posed or it had just continued to come up. And so we just wanted to reemphasize that point.
Okay, thank you. That was my only question. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I'll invite others into the queue by using the raise hand function under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. Maybe while we're seeing if others have questions, I just have a quick follow-up clarification question. Mr. Horton, in responding to Mr. Kramer's question just a few minutes ago about Massachusetts and the MRP design, and what happened in January versus of this year versus last year or the year before. I just wasn't quite clear on the timeline of events. Has so there are 2 of the 3 commissioners in the DPU are new. So has this group of commissioners ruled on, was it the K-bar, or what aspect was under review in January, and has there been a ruling from the current iteration of the DPU on that, please?
Yes, the current commission approved the rate adjustment for effect January 1, 2024, completely consistent with the DPU's order from our rate case, which included an adjustment for both K-bar and for PBR, recognizing the increased level of capital expenditures, and the department's approval prior to January 1, 2024 supported that and acknowledged the increased level of investment and the need to have rates that track that investment. So it was a non-controversial approval from what I could tell.
Understood. So the adjustment, though, was with respect to a rate case that was decided prior to the current bench, if I understood correctly, the timeline. Is that, did I get that correct? The rate case.
Timeline is that the rate case was approved under a commission that had 3 commissioners that are no longer commissioners in Massachusetts. The rate change that went into effect on January 1st of 2024 was ruled on by the current, at least I believe they were all in place at the time. I think that's right. And they authorized and supported that rate change, which is public record. We can certainly share the approval of that by the current constitution of the commission.
Understood. Thank you. I was trying to get the timeline right in my head. I appreciate that. I'm not seeing any others in the queue, so maybe I'll ask another question, please. I had a question based on the slides that were around the I factor. And so I guess the question is a little bit of a hypothetical, but if the authority adjusted the scenario so that the I factor was adjusted annually as opposed to being set once at the beginning of a multi-year rate plan period, wondering if you can react to that, and if not, we can pose that in a different form. But I'm just trying to, I guess the genesis of my question is trying to understand the company's concerns with the design of the I factor and whether that concern stems from the time period at which it's set or adjusted. So just wondering if you could entertain that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like I said at the outset, it's up to you, Chairman, in terms of the sequence or cadence, but I certainly would also welcome my colleagues at UI if they have a commentary that they'd like to share. I think we view this, if not the same, very similarly. So here's what I would say. If you take, you really need to look at the 6 fatal flaws that we see together. The fact that the inflation factor has been set and fixed, to me, doesn't make conceptual sense. But I think more troubling is the fact that the inflation factor, GDPPI, is being set now based on GDPPI without an analysis to demonstrate whether or not that's sufficient. So I sometimes like to think about things in the inverse to see if I test myself on if it being fair. So if we're setting inflation at a level, or setting rates to change at a level, without first determining if that's the right level of change, what if it's too high? What if there was analysis that demonstrated we actually could operate under a paradigm where our rates changed at a level lower than inflation, or whatever measure you put into place? Would that be appropriate for customers? I would argue no. But from a principled basis, we should be setting rates that change annually based on whatever analysis shows what the level of rate change should be. And that's where I get back to, it's a combination of things. In Massachusetts, the analysis was solely focused on what is a measure of inflation that everyone can look to, which is GDPPI. So that isn't troubling. But then it says, how does utilities cost change annually in relation to GDPPI? And the problem we have is that the straw proposal construct doesn't result in a structural framework that assures there's any nexus between the level of rate changes and an expectation of what our cost changes should be. And so it will fail because it could be either too high or too low. And so we're trying to emphasize that the totality of the framework needs to be designed in a way that the rate changes will be commensurate with our cost changes so that we have an opportunity, but not a guarantee to earn a return. So it isn't just the fact that it's fixed at the outset. I think that's a detail that, frankly, I don't understand why that would be appropriate if the idea is that, which it should be, that annually the level of rates reflects an expectation of what our level of costs will be, and those costs inclusive of a return on the investment that we've made and make throughout the period. If you fix it at the beginning, meaning you set an inflation at a given point in time, and then actual inflation is higher or lower than that, if inflation is truly a good measure of what our cost change should be, which again, I don't think it is, there's no evidence that it is on its own, then you would be setting rates at a level that is automatically departed from our costs, either too high or too low. Long way of saying, yes, I don't think it's appropriate to fix it at the outset. It should track if we're trying to have a principal basis for how the rates would change. But also there's other major concerns and flaws with the construct. In addition, that simply allowing the inflation factor to change annually based on the actual level of inflation wouldn't remedy.
Okay. Can I just pull out this? You used the phrase determining the appropriate level a couple of times, and I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by that term, because it could mean a couple of different things in my mind. Like the appropriate level could mean, are you recovering investments that have been deemed recoverable as prudent and reasonable investments? You could be using it to mean that you think appropriate level corresponds to contemporaneous cost recovery for ongoing investments. I just want to make sure I understand what appropriate level means to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd love to, if I'm able to ask the same of you, I'm very curious of that. But to me, and I've emphasized this in a number of forums, and I don't think it's debatable, but maybe it is. The idea of utility rate making, in my experience and expertise and for the duration of my career, all that I have learned is that the idea is to set rates at a level that in any given year provide the utility an opportunity, but not a guarantee, to recover its costs. And those costs include the cost to attract capital, meaning our return. So whatever the paradigm, the rate making construct that a regulator wants to put into place, and we operate in 3 state jurisdictions, each one's different, but the goal of all of them is to come out with a framework that gets revenues, or at least it should be, that track with our costs in any given year. So you might have a framework that says, no, we're only going to allow historical additions at a set point in time. And that's okay, as long as there's some other way for rates to change annually for the duration of the term that allows it to reflect costs of ongoing infrastructure investments as well. So for example, in Massachusetts, right after the Green Communities passed in 2008 or 2009, the Department of Public Utilities implemented revenue decoupling, which fixed the level of revenues for each utility that filed a rate case, and then allowed for a capital cost adjustment for plant that had been placed into service. And that seems like a reasonable framework, except that the Department of Public Utilities set that level of capital support revenue in a way that was severely lagged. So it capped the amount of capital that could be recognized in the mechanism, and it had other offsets that reduce the level of revenues and revenue support, such that the actual earned returns by the utilities continue to decline. And remember, prior to decoupling, all utilities could count on some level of growth in sales each year that provided a modicum of incremental revenues. So although the rate was set historically prior to decoupling based on historical plant that's used and useful, the framework allowed for more revenues to be realized by the utility because there was just natural sales growth. And it had been counted on about 3% a year if you look at the history of utilities prior to the demand response and energy efficiency programs that are so successful, especially here in the Northeast. So what happened after the department implemented decoupling and the capital cost recovery framework that I described is utilities entered into a pattern of filing rate cases every 2 years because it was insufficient. The level of revenues were not sufficient in order to provide the utility an opportunity, but not a guarantee to earn its authorized ROE. So every company was filing rate cases every 2 years. And that is an inefficient use of resources, and ultimately why we proposed a different paradigm, PBR, because the capital cost recovery mechanism framework, again, was producing a level of revenues that was severely lagged and requiring an intense administrative process. But the end result was that utilities were basically in an annual rate case cycle and never earning their authorized ROE, which is again, when a utility isn't earning its authorized ROE, it's simply your income or your revenues less your expenses. So you really have two choices. You can stop spending both in capital or in operating expenses by reducing the expense portion of that equation, keeping revenues the same, or you file a rate case to increase to increase rates or the level of revenues. So when I say what is the appropriate level of revenues, I'm meaning that the structure, whatever we come up with, should be designed to give us the opportunity, but not a guarantee, to earn the authorized ROE. And by having only one side of the adjustments, downward only adjustments, not allowing for capital cost recovery or revenue recognition, not having an X factor that is tailored to the utilities cost trends, all of these things together say that we will not have an opportunity, even a perfectly run utility operating with the benefit of hindsight and judgment would never earn its authorized ROE because by design, it's not supposed to be. The restrictions put in the straw proposal would guarantee a utility wouldn't earn its authorized ROE unless it cuts spending, reduces its spending in the infrastructure. And I think that's not, at this point, a reasonable expectation of what we need to be doing to serve our customers.
And Chairman, if I could add to my client, Mr. Horton's comment, if it's helpful for the record and for the commissioners, the legal support for Mr. Horton's position, which is, in all due respect, we think we should have an opportunity to earn a reasonable rate of return, is when we read the PBR statute, so 16-244 AA, which I know the participants are familiar with, subsection B2 states that the authority will identify the manner in which the standards, meaning the PBR standards, will apply the principles and guidelines in section 1619E. And I think we're all familiar with 1619E, and we know that section A4 of that statute has the HOPE standard in terms of that applies to utility companies. And the language in 1619E A4 states that the level and structure of rates will be sufficient to, among other things, allow a public service company to attract needed capital and to maintain their financial integrity. And it's our position, in all due respect, the PBR statute doesn't change 1619E, and it certainly does not change the constitutional principles. And so that's the legal basis for, my client's position that under a PBR framework, there should be an opportunity to earn an ROE that allows us to attract and retain capital. I hope that's helpful. You heard Mr. Horton provide the policy and financial justification, and I'm providing at least our legal position on the issue. Thank you, Chairman, for the latitude to offer that comment.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm not gonna, okay. Consumer Counsel Coleman, please.
Afternoon, Chair and the Eversource panel. I just had a quick question on really a follow-up to Mr. Kramer's questions and Ms. Trinidad and Mr. Horton, your explanations of Hawaii and Massachusetts. My question is, given the adjustments in CapEx and O&M that are components of the Hawaii and Massachusetts plan, what are the cost containment mechanisms and what in those plans assures that there's some downward pressure, to ensure downward pressure on spending, I guess should say.
Yeah, I can start. Again, I think a fundamental underpinning of the PBR frameworks that I have reviewed and that we're familiar with in Massachusetts is the fact that we make a commitment to stay out of a rate case, which is contemplated by the straw proposal based on my reading. That commitment says that we have to operate under the level of revenues that is afforded to us by the PBR, and in Massachusetts, it's a PBR framework that incorporates a K-bar adjustment for capital. We've committed to stay out. So when I keep saying we have two options, if our returns are insufficient as utilities, there are two options. Under traditional cost of service rate making, one is to reduce our costs and to find ways to be efficient and to operate under the level of revenues that we've been afforded. The other is to file a rate case. So we've made a commitment to the state of Massachusetts to not file a rate case for the duration of the plan, which says that we better find ways to operate efficiently and to save in any way that we can while still upholding our public service obligations and meeting the metrics that are part of a PBR framework. And so that's really the main underpinning, again, of what went into the department in the 1705 order adopting a PBR framework in lieu of a different framework, which did not have that incentive. The point in Massachusetts was that with a rate structure, which I described, where you had a fixed level of revenues only adjusting for capital that was designed to be insufficient. It was not designed to give the utility concurrent recovery or an opportunity to earn on its ongoing investment going forward. It was designed to be severely lagged. That meant that utilities had no ability to be successful and to earn its authorized ROE. So they naturally had to fall into, because they didn't have the cost, there was no expenses to cut. They couldn't cut into the bone anymore. So their only recourse then was to file rate cases. That's why the incentive under PBR is that you've made a commitment to stay out of a rate case. You have to find ways to be efficient by investing in whatever it would be that would allow us to avoid an ongoing operating expense or, reduce our inspection costs, whatever the investment would be, to be optimally running efficiently, because we don't have that other option to file a rate case. That's the key incentive structure there. There is, of course, earnings sharing. In Massachusetts, the earnings sharing framework generally acknowledges that it's in customers' interest to allow for the utility to earn above its authorized ROE by saying that your earnings sharing will kick in after a deadband, which I know is also not being considered here. But it wouldn't come into play here because of the deficiencies. I said a utility would never be in an over-earning position because it is going to be sucking wind from the gate. And that's what we're cautioning, is by having a design that is so severely flawed and so behind the eight ball from the start, there is no incentive for utility to avoid a rate case. It's impossible unless we start cutting costs into the bone where we don't have wasteful spending. That's what I would say is the incentive inherent in that design.
Thanks. And Ms. Trinidad, are there
Sure.
to Hawaii that are layered?
Yeah,
Definitely.
so I know from your question, you're asking what are the cost containment mechanisms. So the mere fact that Hawaii is under a multi-year rate plan and there's the I minus X formula, that means that their revenues are capped, because their revenues can only increase by the I inflation minus X, which in Hawaii is 0. That means that they have to make sure that they operate efficiently to be able to, operate within the budget, the revenue budget or cap. So that's in a way cost containment incentive, which would benefit the customers. So in addition to the stay out that Doug mentioned.
I don't think I have any follow-up. Thank you, Chair Gillette.
There is
Okay.
also a consumer dividend. I'm sorry, it just came back to me. In Massachusetts, there is a consumer dividend when inflation exceeds 2%, recognizing that with a higher inflation, that would provide us an opportunity to perform better than inflation. And so that the consumer dividend kicks in under those circumstances as well. Sorry.
Thank you. And Ms. Trinidad, is there a comprehensive shared savings mechanism in Hawaii? I think there is, right?
Yes, I think they have. Yep.
All right, Consumer Council, anything further?
No, thank you.
Very good, thank you. I'm not seeing any other hands up, which I think means that we can go ahead and move into our lunch break. So Ms. Trinidad and Mr. Horton, thank you for the presentation, for answering our questions. We're gonna take our lunch break a little bit early, so if I could just get a signal from Mr. Hurwitz or Ms. Van Luling that you would be amenable to coming on like 1:15.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, so let's see everybody back at 1:15, please. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll call us back to order. If we can go back on the record, we'll continue with our agenda for this docket. And we are up to the presentation from the United Illuminating Company. So Ms. Van Lilling, Mr. Hurwitz, welcome back. And if you could let me know whether you'd prefer to control the slides or if you'd like Ms. Lupley to.
We'd prefer Ms. Lupley too.
Okay, very good. If you give her a second, and then the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. So Ms. Lupley, do you mind going to the next slide? Great, thank you. So I'm Andrea Van Lilling. I'm the Networks Controller, and I'm joined here today by Jacob Hurwitz, who is the Senior Director of Revenue Requirements at Avangrid. And we're here today on behalf of UI. We are also joined virtually by a number of our coworkers who are in the background. Some are legal counsel and some are outside consultants, but Mr. Hurwitz and myself will walk through the presentation. We did want to mention that we have similar findings to those outlined by Mr. Horton earlier today. So starting on this slide, we would all agree that basic rate-making principles involve balancing the interests of both the consumer and the utility company while ensuring fair and reasonable rates. So fair and reasonable rates must allow the utility to recover its reasonable and prudently incurred costs of providing service, including operating and maintenance expenses, and a fair return on and of investments. While rates can and should provide incentives for the utility to operate efficiently, thereby helping minimize costs and maximizing value for customers, or advance public policy goals such as environmental sustainability, energy conservation, and the promotion of affordable and reliable utility services for all customers, rates that are not just and reasonable undermine the utility's ability to help accomplish those goals. By setting rates that are just and reasonable, PURA can ensure that utility rates promote the long-term interests of both consumers and the utility company. So as we get into the intricacies of PURA's straw proposal, it becomes evident that there are significant concerns in that it is straying from basic rate-making principles. So one of the foremost issues lies in the approach to setting going-in rates, which unfortunately suffers from deficiencies. Firstly, the failure to include known and measurable pro forma adjustments raises serious questions about the fairness principle and results in the utility not being able to recover prudently incurred costs. Furthermore, the restrictions on timely rate recovery for used and useful plant additions impedes our ability to adequately recover costs and invest in essential infrastructure. Additionally, the implementation of an asymmetrical, downward-only approach to normalizing adjustments introduces further complexities and severe negative financial implications into the equation. Because of these deficiencies, among others, we've conducted a thorough financial analysis to assess the potential ramifications of the straw proposal. And UI's analysis reveals alarming findings. If implemented, this proposal could have a devastating financial effect on UI. And as requested in the authority's notice for the technical meeting, Mr. Hurwitz will walk through the details of that financial analysis later on in this presentation and discuss how these details informed our recommended modifications to the straw proposal. If you don't mind turning to the next slide, slide 3. Thank you. So we must address a critical issue that could profoundly impact UI's ability to fulfill PURA's priority outcomes. The straw proposal's approach to setting going-in rates falls short of reflecting the true costs incurred by UI at the time rates go into effect. So let's get into the specifics. So firstly, the rejection of pro forma adjustments in the straw proposal virtually guarantees that resulting rates won't cover essential operating costs. So what are these costs? These costs include union wage increases, increasing healthcare costs, inflationary expenses, and the cost of additional staff supporting policy goals. Secondly, the proposal stance on plant and service would deny rate recovery for essential plant additions until the next rate case. This would severely impede the utility's ability to earn its authorized return and invest in critical infrastructure. Lastly, the proposal's asymmetrical, downward-only approach to normalizing adjustments further compounds the issue. By prohibiting common upward adjustments such as annualizing expenses incurred partly through the test year, the proposal sets rates that are unlikely to cover operating costs. These deficiencies, if left unremedied, threaten to undermine our ability to meet Pure's priority outcomes, and we must address these concerns urgently to ensure the financial stability and dependability of UI. If you don't mind turning to slide 4. Thank you. So by neglecting to incorporate these known and measurable adjustments, the straw proposal ensures that our rates will not accurately reflect legitimate costs incurred by the utility to provide safe and reliable service. This omission leads to a concerning outcome: rates that are significantly outdated by the time they take effect. So in fact, under this proposal, rates will realistically be at least 18 months stale upon implementation. By the time the first inflation adjustment is made in rate year 2, this staleness will have extended to a staggering 30 months. And such a delay not only undermines the accuracy of our rate setting process, but also jeopardizes our ability to adequately cover essential costs and maintain the reliability of our services. So it's imperative that our rates reflect the true cost of providing essential services to our communities. If you don't mind turning to slide 5. Thank you. So firstly, the straw proposal's omission of any inflation adjustment in rate year 1 presents a troubling scenario. So rates during this period will fail to account for at least 18 months of inflation, creating a significant shortfall. So by the time the inflation adjustment, or the I factor, is applied in rate year 2, the overall economy would have grown substantially. So we did the math, and that was 3.73% in docket 130119 and 3.34% in docket 160604. While our revenues would have remained stagnant under the straw proposal. So this shortfall is not just temporary either. It's locked in for rate years 2, 3, and 4. So if you don't mind turning to slide 6. Thank you. So the Handy Whitman Index, which is a proxy used by Pure to measure changes in the actual cost of providing utility services over time, it serves as a tool for assessing the trends in utility costs relative to broader economic indicators. And since 2010, the Handy Whitman Index, which again is Pure's proxy for actual utility costs, has escalated more rapidly than the GDP PI. And despite this fact, the straw proposal would have produced rates that increased less rapidly than the GDP PI because it omits any inflation adjustments from rate year 1. So the chart to the right of the screen compares the Handy Whitman Index versus the GDP PI, demonstrating this disconnect. You don't mind turning to slide 7? So the proposal's approach to plant and service prevents our ability to earn our authorized return. In previous rate cases, applying the straw proposal would have resulted in a significant lack of return on our invested capital, jeopardizing our financial sustainability and our ability to reinvest in essential infrastructure. So the company, UI, would have had no return on or of approximately $121 million of invested capital during the multi-year rate plan in docket 130119. That's about 9% of gross plant at the end of the test year in that case, and $45 million of invested capital during the multi-year rate plan in docket 160604, which is approximately 3% of the gross plant as of the end of the test year in that case. So if you don't mind turning to slide 8. Thank you. So we've included an illustrative example to show how the straw proposal's failure to provide UI a return on or of plant additions made after the close of the evidentiary record, but before the beginning of rate year 1, defeats UI's ability to earn its authorized return. So while the table below presents an illustrated 10-year assets for presentation purposes, similar concepts apply to longer-lived assets. We've just used this as an example. So as you can see, the returns on equity in years 1 through 4 are negative. A common metric used to evaluate the profitability of an investment is the IRR. That's the internal rate of return. This represents the discount rate at which the net present value of all cash flows from the investment equals 0. So in simpler terms, it's the rate at which an investment breaks even in terms of its present value. Higher IRRs typically indicate more attractive investment opportunities. And as you can see in this example, the IRR is negative 11%. So what does that mean? That means that this investment is not expected to be profitable. Essentially, it means the investment's costs outweigh its returns, making it unattractive and financially detrimental. So if an investment in UI is determined to be financially detrimental by equity investors, that fact will deter local investment as well. And these deficiencies will mean fewer dollars invested in the local community, which will ultimately influence others to invest less. So who are the others? Businesses, developers. They're all going to be deterred from investing in the communities. So moving on to slide 9. Thank you. So these deficiencies in the Straw's proposals approach to going in rates pose a significant threat to our ability to achieve PURE's priority outcomes. They lock in deficiencies in future rate years and limit our ability to recover essential costs, including those related to operational performance, public policy achievement, customer empowerment, and reasonable, equitable, and affordable rates. We are supportive of PURE's priority outcomes. However, we have significant challenges that we will encounter under the current Straw proposal. For the priority outcome of excellent operational performance, the Straw proposal limits the utility's ability to recover the cost of its employees, including its union employees, and investments necessary to provide reliable and resilient electric service. For the priority outcome of public policy achievement, the Straw proposal limits the utility's ability to achieve new public policy goals due to the lack of recovery of any required incremental costs, such as the additional FTEs and investments, absent explicit timely recovery outside of a multi-year rate plan. And for the priority outcome of customer empowerment and satisfaction, the Straw proposal limits the utility's ability to recover the cost of its employees, including its customer service employees, and investments that empower customers. And for the priority outcome of reasonable, equity, and affordable rates, the Straw proposal will increase the utility's cost of capital and force the utility to kick the can down the road on certain investments, thereby increasing costs for future customers. And as a result, the next generation may feel unfairly burdened by these costs without getting the proportional benefits. So I'm going to turn it over now to Mr. Hurwitz, who will walk through the details of the financial analysis.
Thank you. As Ms. Van Luling foreshadowed, our financial analysis demonstrates that the Straw proposal would be financially devastating to UI because of the various departures from sound rate-making practices that Ms. Van Luling described. At a high level, we analyzed what the revenue requirement and resulting ROEs would have been had the Straw proposal been in place for the company's last 2 multi-year rate plan rate cases. Specifically, its 2013 and 2016 rate cases, docket numbers 130119 and 160604, respectively. As I'll describe in more detail on the following slides, our analysis demonstrates that the reductions produced by the Straw proposal are so drastic that they cannot be mitigated by productivity or efficiency measures realistically. And I know that basis points of ROE might be difficult to put into context. So to illustrate the severity of the reductions implied by our financial analysis, we added the text box at the bottom left of this slide, which indicates in 2018, our analysis demonstrates that the rates produced by the Straw proposal are approximately, or would have been approximately $48 million lower than what the authority actually approved in that year. In other words, even if UI were somehow magically able to reduce its payroll expense to zero, the rates produced by the straw proposal would still have been insufficient for UI to cover its cost of providing service in that year. Please move to the next slide. As described in our December 21, 2023 written comments, and as summarized here, our, and maybe it's just me, the presentation appears to still be on slide 10. Is there any chance we could move forward one slide? Oh, thank you. So our backcast or counterfactual analyses of UI's 2013 and 2016 rate cases and what they would have looked like had the straw proposal been in effect were both conducted in 6 sequential steps. First, we identified revenues, expenses, and rate base from the unadjusted historical test year. In both cases, in UI's 2013 rate case, the test year was 12 months ended June 30th, 2012. In UI 2016 rate case, the test year was calendar year 2015. Second, we described, and as we described in response to a recent discovery request in this proceeding, we identified any downward normalizing adjustments reflected in the approved revenue requirements in those proceedings, either proposed by the company or imposed by the authority. Third, we implemented the straw proposal's guidance that we should use 9 months after the application date as a filing date as a proxy for the close of the evidentiary record for pro forma additions, retirements, and adjustments to plant and service, accumulated depreciation, and depreciation expense. Fourth, we identified the amount of regulatory amortization approved by the authority by rate year in both rate cases. Fifth, we utilized the results of the preceding 4 steps to complete the calculation of the rate year 1 revenue requirement, or the going in rates, which would play a large role in determining the rates in rate years 2, 3, and 4. And sixth, and finally, we then applied the straw proposal's proposed revenue cap formula to backcast the revenue requirement in rate years 2, 3, and 4 of the straw proposal. With that, I'll provide a walkthrough on the following slides of the exhibits that we filed accompanying our December 21st, 2023 written comments, and discuss, as the authority requested, the specific methodologies that we applied to analyze the potential impacts of the straw proposal. This slide provides an excerpt of Exhibit UI2, which relates to the 2016 rate case. Exhibit UI8 provides comparable information for UI's 2013 rate case. These exhibits, as described, show that our analysis started by simply summarizing all of the big ticket inputs to the revenue requirement computation in each rate case. That includes, as shown here, information about O&M expense, depreciation, amortization, other taxes, etc. It also includes information regarding rate base and the cost of capital, which is also summarized in Exhibit UI2 and UI8, but that was a little too much to fit on this one slide. And in short, while both exhibits present lots of information from the 2013 and 2016 rate cases, that information was not intended to be new, and it did not result from a special computation that we conducted for the limited purpose of this proceeding. Rather, both exhibits were intended to simply summarize information from those proceedings as they occurred, because that was intended to be the launching point for our financial analysis. We could please move to the next slide. This slide is an excerpt of Exhibit UI3, page 2, which again relates to the 2013 rate case, and Exhibit UI9, page 2, is its peer for the 2013 rate case. As described in our recently filed response to UPA 20, the straw proposal proposed using a historical test year without pro forma adjustment, but also requires UI to demonstrate, quote, that all O&M, tax, and miscellaneous expenses are recurring or otherwise indicative of typical annual costs and not anomalous, end quote. Therefore, for purposes of this analysis, we assume that the straw proposal would adopt any downward normalizing adjustments from the 2016 rate case, like adjustments to remove non-recurring costs or costs disallowed by the authority for rate-making purposes, and also, second, reject any upward normalizing adjustments from that case. The information summarized in this screenshot represents the underlying computations that result from that assumption. Specifically, UI reviewed the record from the 2016 rate case to identify the downward normalizing adjustments. And this is the results of that review. Lines 1 through 13 summarize the downward normalizing adjustments reflected in the company's proposed revenue requirement, both what it proposed initially in lines 1 through 11 and what it reflected in its case update in that proceeding, LF Late File Exhibit 3 on line 12. Likewise, lines 14 through 25 summarize the additional relevant adjustments reflected in the revenue requirement established by the authority. And for convenience, we provide on the right citations to the various places in the record that support the values we identified. We could please move to the next slide. This slide represents an excerpt of Exhibit UI 9, page 2, which again relates to the 2013 rate case, with Exhibit UI 3, page 2 being its peer for the 2016 rate case. And this illustrates how we implemented the straw proposal's recommended approach to plant and depreciation. UI filed in the 2013 rate case in the first quarter of 2013, therefore is a proxy for the 9 months after filing guidance in the straw proposal. We used UI's actual gross plant and accumulated depreciation balances as of December 31st, 2013 for purposes of adjusting rate base. Further, as shown on numbered lines 25 through 29 herein, we used a composite average depreciation rate for purposes of computing the adjustment to depreciation expense. And it's not noted on this slide, but I'll take this opportunity to emphasize that UI agrees with the comments we heard from CLMP earlier today regarding the importance of period end depreciation. Going in rates must reflect utility rate year costs, including depreciation expense. And a historical 13-month average, by definition, does not reflect rate year costs and fails to align depreciation expense with the underlying gross plant in service to customers. Accordingly, one of the modifications that we've proposed to the straw proposal is to use period end depreciation rather than a 13-month average. We could please move to the next slide. Next, we simply identified the annual amortization of regulatory deferrals that was approved by the authority in both the 2013 and the 2016 rate cases. Our assumption is that PBR would not have changed the authority's findings with respect to those items. And further, as we'll see in a moment, it was computationally important that we identify the annual amortization of regulatory deferrals in the approved revenue requirement so that we could avoid applying an inflation adjustment to those amounts as the straw proposal required. This particular screenshot is again from Exhibit UI 3, page 2, with comparable information being presented on Exhibit UI 9, page 2 for the company's 2013 rate case. Please move to the next slide. Again, in step 5, we brought it all together and we computed the revised rate year 1 revenue requirement produced by the previous 4 steps and produced by the straw proposal's rate-making methodology. This screenshot is from Exhibit UI 3, page 1, and summarizes the results of that computation. The bottom portion of page 2 of Exhibits UI 3 and Exhibit UI 9 provide the so-called guts of the underlying computation. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Finally, after computing going in rates, we next compute rates in rate years 2, 3, and 4 according to the straw proposal's revenue cap formula. As required, we strip out regulatory amortizations and depreciation, then just apply a general inflation adjustment to the resulting subtotal. We add regulatory amortizations and depreciation expense back in without inflation adjustment, again, as required by the straw proposal, and the resulting revenues are the final result of our analysis. I'll note that, as shown here, UI assumed that the I factor component of the revenue cap formula was a fixed 2% per year, with no adjustment for either a stretch factor, i.e. the S factor or consumer dividend, or annual fluctuations in inflation. As described in our recently filed response to UPA 18, UI chose to reflect this assumption in its financial analysis in part because we could not readily determine the intent of the straw proposal. For example, the straw proposal notes the intensive vetting through the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis of the GDP PI. However, the Bureau of Economic Analysis generally publishes historical, not forward-looking data, and if the straw proposal intended to propose a historically derived measure of inflation, it wasn't clear to us what historical period was to be used for that measurement or how it was determined that history would be representative of the past, particularly in today's inflationary environment. Accordingly, rather than attempt to interpret the intent of the straw proposal, the financial analysis UI as shown here reflects a fixed 2% inflation factor per year. The company's December 21st, 2023 written comments discusses the various approaches to setting the inflation factor in more detail, and our comments there are consistent with what we heard from our colleagues at CL&P earlier today. Please move on to the next slide. Thank you. This slide summarizes the results of our financial analysis for the years immediately following our 2013 and 2016 rate case outcomes. These results have been condensed for the purposes of this presentation, but more fulsome results were presented in the exhibits that accompanied our December 20 written comments. And as shown, and as both Ms. Van Booling and myself have highlighted, the straw proposal would have resulted in extremely significant reductions to UI's revenues because of the deficiencies in approach that we've described. The magnitude of these reductions are such that they cannot possibly be mitigated through productivity, efficiency, or cost-saving measures we could take. For context, in UI 2016 rate case, the total amount of approved labor expense in 2018 was approximately $46 million. The total amount of depreciation expense was approximately $57 million. The total amount of outside services was approximately $28 million. These are huge core components of our revenue requirement that, as a practical matter, we cannot avoid incurring. The straw proposal does not appear to offer insight into how we can realistically provide safe and reliable service while simultaneously advancing the authority's priority outcomes without recovering such a significant portion of our costs. Therefore, as Ms. Van Booling described at the outset of our presentation, and consistent with the comments from Mr. Horton and CL&P earlier today, UI has and continues to have grave concerns with the straw proposal because it represents a foundational departure from rate-making principles and will defeat our ability to accomplish the priority outcomes. We could please move to the next slide. These last two slides provide UI's proposed modifications to the straw proposal. I'll walk through now the changes that relate to the approach to going-in rates at a high level, and the company's December 21st written comments again provide additional details. In general, these modifications are intended to achieve three outcomes. One, to bring greater balance to PBR in Connecticut to better support the achievement of the broader set of priority outcomes. Two, to ensure that the PBR mechanism is more holistic and that its components work in harmony. And three, to better align the PBR mechanism with industry precedents, including Hawaii and Massachusetts. The first two modifications shown here relate to the establishment of the revenue requirement that forms the cost-based foundation of the PBR revenue formula. And those are to allow for symmetrical normalizing as well as known and measurable pro forma adjustments to the test year. Symmetrical adjustments ensure that the test year is appropriately normalized and reflective of going forward conditions and are nearly universally employed in establishing cost of service-based rates as well as the jumping off point for PBR mechanisms. Likewise, pro forma adjustments are a common feature across PBR and non-PBR states alike and ensure that the beginning point for a PBR plan is reflective of the utility's costs. In a similar vein, the company proposes that the straw proposal be modified to reflect period-end depreciation rather than a historical average. The use of period-end depreciation is more reflective of depreciation expense that will occur in the rate year and provides the company a better opportunity to recover its costs. As Mr. Horton described, rates should allow the utility a reasonable opportunity, but not a guarantee, to recover its costs and earn a fair rate of return on and of invested capital as enumerated in Connecticut General Statute 16-19. And that same reasoning supports the company's proposal to escalate depreciation expense throughout the PBR plan and not hold it flat absent an inflation adjustment as the straw proposal proposes. In terms of plant and service, the company has proposed a modification to the straw proposal such that plant additions through the end of the first rate year be reflected in going-in rates for the reasons described by Ms. Van Booling. If PURA were to adopt this modification, then it may be appropriate to revert to a different approach to computing depreciation expense. We have a variety of other recommendations, all of which are aligned with what we heard from our colleagues at CL&P earlier today, and all of which are described in further detail in our December 21st written comments. But those are our recommendations that relate to the establishment of going-in rates. And I'll leave it there for now, and Ms. Van Beuling and myself can answer any questions that folks may have on the material that we just ran through.
All right, let's start with questions from Mr. Kramer from Pura staff, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Ms. Van Luling and Mr. Hurwitz for the presentation. Just a couple questions from me. First off, the Handy-Whitman index that Ms. Van Luling mentioned during her portion of the presentation, has the company done an analysis of why the Handy-Whitman index has increased significantly over GDPPI in recent years? And if so, I'm curious about the findings of the divergence there.
I'll start, and then invite Ms. Van Beuling to add to the extent she has further commentary. The Handy-Whitman Index is an independently published third-party publication that's not produced by the company. My understanding is it's intended to represent trends in utility costs, and that the authority has found it to be representative of how utility costs have trended. We've heard other comments earlier in this proceeding regarding why utility costs may trend in a direction that's different from the overall economy, particularly in the context of discussions of an appropriate X factor. I'm recalling commentary earlier in this proceeding that so-called output for a utility is fixed. The number of kilowatt hours due to successful energy efficiency and other measures it changes year to year, but at a relatively low rate, while the inputs required to produce those same outputs are growing. There's an ever-changing suite of regulatory requirements with which we operate. We're affected by a number of macroeconomic forces which we cannot control, and that may cause a divergence between how utility costs change and how inflation in the overall economy changes. And that's one of the reasons why we're concerned with the straw proposal's sole use of an inflation factor. That's not necessarily representative of how utility costs have trended in the past.
Okay, thank you for that. I think what I'm hearing is that the company has not done an independent evaluation of the divergence between the Handy-Whitman index and GDPPI. Is that right?
Could you help me with what you mean by independent evaluation?
Certainly, thank you. I'm wondering if you can help, since it's been brought into the record, if you can help us understand in the proceeding the nature of that index in terms of what might be driving the difference between the straw proposal inflation factor tied to GDPPI. So if it's being introduced here as an alternative, how can we understand it in comparison to GDPPI, please?
Well, the Handy-Whitman is specific to just utilities.
Understood. And I guess my question is getting at what is driving that significant difference in the inflation index there. And it sounds like that's like Mr. Hurwitz, you gave some kind of broad strokes about the nature of utility costs and the rate at which they change. But if that's as far as the company has commentary on that, that's fine.
Yeah, and my apologies, Mr. Kramer. I'm just getting a little bit thrown because we were thinking, the authority has already found the Handy-Whitman index to be reflective of how utility costs have trended in the past. In docket number 220808, the authority utilized the Handy-Whitman index to restate our major storm cost threshold, and we quoted a subset of the language from that order, describing why the authority found it to be reasonable. So and we've done further analysis beyond what we presented here today. I've described sort of, as you said, the broad stroke factors that might cause that divergence to occur. And I think that's been discussed previously in this proceeding, but I'm just a little bit surprised, I think is.
Understood. I'm trying to get the to bring that information over into this record and into this evidentiary record to understand what the company is proposing here. So that leads into my next question, which is the company including Handy Whitman Index in the discussion today as a recommended alternative to GDPPI, or is it included for some other purpose?
Generally, UI is concerned that the straw proposal solely relies on an inflation index to change utility revenues in rate years 2, 3, and 4. We've proposed, similar to Eversource, a capital funding mechanism that would allow our rates in those years to better match the costs that we must incur in providing service. And our intention in bringing in the Handy Whitman Index was to demonstrate the disconnect that will occur, or will very likely occur, absent further adjustment to the straw proposal formula. You know, the comparison of Handy Whitman to the GDPPI demonstrates that historically, a simple inflation adjustment with no other changes would have understated the utilities costs. And, you know, our intention in bringing that comparison was to highlight that disconnect. And we've proposed other changes to the straw proposals mechanism that would get at that, including the introduction of a capital funding mechanism, including all of our adjustments to milling in rates and the other things listed here. But that's what we were intending to highlight.
Understood. Thank you. That clarifies my question. My next question is related to slide 16, which in the stepwise description of the analysis that was provided, I'm in particular the line item operating distribution revenues. I'm curious if you could just speak to a little more specifically. I know we have in the exhibit or in the information that was filed the details. But I'm curious if you can explain for the purposes of today's meeting more of what's included in there, and specifically if there's any of those revenues would cover capital investments, or if it's purely operating.
And maybe, Ms. Lupley, is there any chance we could flip back to that slide just so I make sure I'm speaking to the exact line Mr. Kramer is questioning? Slide 16.
Thank you. Yes.
Mr.
So
Kramer about
line number
numbered
one.
line 1.
Yes, please.
Numbered line 1 comes from UI. In this case, this is the 2016 rate case exhibit UI 3. So this comes from our 2016 rate case and was operating distribution revenues in the test year. As our understanding was the straw proposal use revenues, expenses, rate base, et cetera, from the historical test year without pro forma adjustment. And your question about, is this intended to cover operating expenses or capital? This particular line isn't intended to cover anything in particular. It's the company's revenues at current rates in the test year. The rate increase shown on line 3 is what we found to be the mathematical result of all of the preceding adjustments that we described. But that particular line you're questioning, numbered line 1, operating distribution revenues, was intended to be test year revenues at current rates, as we understood the straw proposal to require.
Okay, thank you. And Chairman, that's all that I have.
Thank you. Are there stakeholders who would like to get into the queue for questions of the UI team? If so, please use the raise hand function under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. Okay, I'm not seeing any. I'm going to ask one question, and if we don't get any others in the queue, then we will adjourn. So, my question, and I would appreciate if you could focus on responding to the question, because I understand that there are other aspects of the straw proposal that you take issue with in the aggregate, but I have a very specific question about one of the aspects of it, and it's how would the company's how or would the company's analysis change with respect to the straw proposal if known and measurable adjustments could be made to the test year O&M expenses for year one? And I can restate that if needed.
I understand, and I'll try to answer specifically what you're asking. And please let me know if I lost the mark. We presented our second step was a discrete summary of the downward normalizing adjustments that we identified, and there was a big list of rows with all of the specific adjustments. And then the next section of that same exhibit, we jumped right to plant. We added no known and measurable adjustments into our analysis as we understood the straw proposal to require. If that particular element of the straw proposal were to change, our financial analysis would then correspondingly need to change to build in whatever nature of known and measurable adjustments this, I'll call it, revised straw proposal would contemplate. So I can't speak right now to the exact mathematical effect of that change, but conceptually that's the modification we would make.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. If I can ask a similar question and maybe directionally what this would do, or conceptually, if the authority modified the straw proposal such that inflation is applied to the O&M expenses starting in rate year one, because I think the straw proposal has it starting in rate year two. Can you speak to, like, conceptually or directionally how that might affect your analysis, please?
And if I can ask one clarifying question, would this be in addition to the known and measurable change, or separate and apart from that?
I think it's an addition to. I'm trying to ask these questions to build on each other. But if you think that the analysis or your response changes drastically, if I'm asking one or the other, but I mean these questions to be incremental to each other.
We
or
would
added.
make. I think what we would do would be conceptually similar. We build it into a similar place in our analysis, and I wanted to clarify, just because some of the known and measurable adjustments we would bring in would be for inflation, and so I would want to be careful to not be duplicative in that adjustment. But conceptually, it would be similar. We would build in an extra step to increase O&M expense, whether for known and measurable adjustments, inflation, or both in concert as appropriate at that point in the analysis. And directionally, that would increase the revenue requirement that is computed from the straw proposal. I'm not prepared to say by exactly how much or anything of that nature, but conceptually, it would work in that direction, I would expect.
Understood. Thank you. And then the third and final, kind of meant to build on that, is those two, plus if the straw proposal changed such that the I factor is adjusted annually instead of being set at the beginning of the multi-year rate plan as proposed in the straw proposal.
That would also affect our financial analysis, but it would affect it in a different way than the previous two. The previous two changes, I focused on Exhibit UI3, page 2, which is the page of our exhibits showing how we implemented the straw proposals framework for going in rates. Subject to check, I believe it's Exhibit UI3, page 3, that shows how we then take that calculated going in rate and apply the straw proposals revenue cap formula to determine revenues in rate years 2, 3, and 4. We would, and as I described earlier, and as reflected in the data request response we just submitted, we used a fixed 2% inflation rate as in light of what we perceive to be ambiguity in the straw proposals methodology. If the methodology for determining the inflation rate were to change, that particular row of that exhibit would change accordingly.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate those responses. It seems like we have attracted 2 hands in the queue, so I'll go in order. Mr. Horton?
Thank you, Chairman. Actually, I can cede to Tom. You had mentioned if there weren't questions for UI that the meeting would adjourn, but we do have questions, or I do, and I'm looking forward to the stakeholder discussion. So I just wanted to put a pin in that and make sure that there was time for that if that was still acceptable. But I don't have questions specifically for UI. Thank you.
Not questions for UI though. Okay. Okay, thank you. Attorney Wheel.
Thank you, Chairman. Tom Wheel again from Office of Consumer Counsel. I was just wondering, both companies, but especially UI, since that's who I'm asking, have raised the issue of capital mechanisms to fund incremental capital investments, and the perspective that the straw proposal is missing that. I was just curious if the company had specific ideas, maybe from other jurisdictions. I know there's some discussion about Alberta and Massachusetts during the Eversource presentation too, about mechanisms other than going in rate mechanisms that allow for projections or pro forma adjustments to capital funding that I guess my question is just, does the company have a position on what kind of mechanisms would be preferable?
Sure. So ideally, it would be something that looks like a capital tracker, where you calculate whatever the revenue requirement is on the capital that is spent during the period that's not in the revenue requirement from the most recent rate case. And that would get trued up annually through like either a surcharge or a different existing mechanism that would allow us essentially to collect the depreciation, the incremental property taxes, and the return on that capital that has been invested in that middle period.
Thanks. Just curious if you have a preference, obviously, not ask, I'm just curious, as between the kind of current model that's in place pre-PBR, which, as you know, like the way it's been done historically in Connecticut is a historic test year with pro forma adjustments, and that includes consideration for capital investments for that model, as opposed to something like an incremental mechanism that reconciles.
Yeah, a capital tracker mechanism means that nobody wins or loses, right? In the other model, if we underspent, essentially we would have over-earned, and if we overspent, we've essentially under-earned. A capital mechanism keeps everybody true to exactly what is spent in capital for that revenue requirement. So there's no ability to have a difference between what you're actually spending for capital versus what's coming in through the revenue requirement. So it's the most closely aligned to the true rate-making principles.
Okay. So it sounds like the preference would be for a tracker then. Is that the?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Isn't there, not trying to be argumentative at all, but the last comment about aligned with rate-making principles, isn't there a rate-making principle that the model that we have now, isn't the idea sort of built into that rate-making model that it creates risk for the company, or at least it simulates risk to not have a reconciling mechanism to kind of essentially establish a budget moving forward, and that the company is at risk of not adhering to that budget, which kind of creates the incentive for cost savings and all the things we've talked about in the docket so far.
Yeah, that's true. But even with a capital tracker, all of the CapEx goes under review, would be reviewed, right, for prudently incurred capital. And we stand by, if we overspend, it's because it was necessary to do that overspending. So this allows, to have that mechanism that if the budgets are a little bit off, to be able to spend on necessary costs.
Okay.
If I could just add, and I don't want to be argumentative either, Mr. Wheel, but you described, isn't it true that the rate making model we have today creates risk? I think many of the folks on this phone know that UI has some real concerns with the rate making model it has today coming out of docket 220808 and also with the straw proposal. So, I don't know exactly what you were referring to with the rate model we have today, but, I don't want to rehash those disagreements here, but I just want to emphasize that.
That's true. I was speaking, and I thank you, Jacob. I was speaking more to the rate model we used to have prior to the most recent UI rate case.
And I was definitely not speaking at all about the UI rate case, in which I've entered an appearance in the appeal, so I'm definitely not speaking about that. But I was more just speaking to the general, the notion of sort of general rate making principles. And again, honestly, not trying to be argumentative, because I agree that I think both of these are sort of general rate making ideas, right? Like there's the kind of traditional idea of the forward test year with a preset kind of capital budget, if for lack of a better word, where deviance from that budget is at the risk of either side, essentially, right? That if ultimately, at least in real time, if the company underspends its allowed budget, then that's arguably a risk to ratepayers, mitigated eventually by the earning sharing mechanism or in the next rate case, et cetera. I go on and on, but that's all I was really asking, is that it seems to me that kind of both models adhere to basic rate making principles from kind of different directions. Thanks. I guess that wasn't a question, that was just me blabbing, but thanks for allowing me to ask questions.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for the UI team? If not, thank you very much for your presentation, for answering our question.
Thank you.
Okay, have general time set aside for stakeholder open discussion. If there was any comments that folks have not had an opportunity to make on the topic of today's technical meeting. Mr. Horton.
Great, thank you. I do have a few questions, and I'm really looking forward to stakeholder engagement. We presented and talked about a lot of the fatal flaws that we see with the straw proposal. But our goal is to try to get to a place where we can support PBR. And I'm really interested in whether it's here and now or in some way having, feedback and dialogue on some of the concepts that we've put out. I think we are, aligned with what UI said in many respects, and maybe some details and around the edges we're not. But the concepts and the theories are certainly we're aligned. But so I guess my interest is in trying to see how we can get some reactions from others, non-utilities, where our positions were fairly strong and pointed. So I don't know, Chairman, if it's possible for the PURA to opine, or to its staff, or maybe this is just for the OCC. I'm not sure the process, but again, we're really genuinely interested in getting feedback so that we could try to understand. We see things in a very clear and certain way, and are concerned it's not going to work. I'm not sure if there's things that we are missing or folks think that we're missing. So maybe I'll just pose one was, we were asked a question, and maybe this could be directed to the OCC around a commitment to stay out, or excuse me, the cost control incentives inherent in either the Massachusetts model or in other jurisdictions. I talked about the commitment to stay out of a rate case, which is an element of the PURA straw proposal. I'm curious for others' reactions on whether or not they see that as being a cost control incentive built into that framework, or if are folks looking for something different or not, or if a stay out isn't imperative. I know there was a discussion in a prior technical session that perhaps, I think it was Tom, you weren't thinking it was a necessary component. How does that work then, if it's not? How do you see PBR being any different than what we have today?
I guess since you asked me directly, I'll
not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot.
Yeah,
Yes.
I was thinking of the discussion we had in the last technical meeting, that I think maybe the model doesn't need to be as strictly binary as like a stay out, like what we have historically in Connecticut as a result of settlements, where there's sort of a stay out that is inarguably a stay out until a date certain, as opposed to something like we talked about last time, where there could be off ramps or guardrails or some sort of predetermined triggers for when things get too out of whack one way or the other, for there to be a mechanism to adjust potentially only part of or the entire rate case, right? The entire revenue requirement. And I think that is one example of what, as far as my limited understanding of the history of rate cases here, that we haven't had, right? That, I mean, that's not in place right now, at least with respect to Eversource's most recent settlement. That wasn't an element that I, as far as I know of that settlement agreement, that there was some sort of way to determine, way to kind of reopen the conversation before the expiration of the stay out period. In terms of what those guardrails or off ramps specifically look like, I think in my opinion, it would be really dependent on the whole universe of what's in the rate case. I don't know if it makes sense to kind of precision design something like that in something like this docket where we're kind of just talking about concepts. Because in my mind, I'm curious if you agree, a guardrail or an off ramp should be, you know, specific to a specific concern of either the company or OCC or the authority of something, of an element to the kind of the rate plan that's being effectuated. You know, what happens if X? I think X needs to kind of depend on the facts that are in that case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Generally, no, I would agree. And I think that's what an exogenous mechanism is typically intended for, where you'd have a specific set of circumstances that have to apply. It needs to be material, not, you know, reflected in the I-X or whatever the PBR framework is. And then that would allow for a reopening either way. But maybe the next question I have is more because it's building off what you just asked of UI, but also again, oh, Claire, did you have a reaction?
Actually, I just had a separate question that I was hoping to have you and our UI representatives answer.
Okay, do you want to do that now?
I don't know how many questions you have. I'll let the chair decide if she wants you to go through yours, and then I'll ask mine, or I can jump in either way.
I would say, just generally speaking, appreciate the desire for dialogue. I'm looking at our next steps and see we do have another set of written comments on the horizon. So I would just flag, to the extent that folks aren't prepared to react to the presentations today, which is not to say that you can't and shouldn't pose your questions, Mr. Horton. I think posing them is certainly helpful. But to the extent that folks aren't prepared to respond, we do still have quite a runway in front of us in terms of this docket and allowing for additional discovery and development of some of these concepts. So why don't we just have Mr. Horton, you can certainly pose the questions, and if folks want to respond today, or can choose to respond, you know, in writing or at our next tech meeting, and then maybe we'll go to the Consumer Counsel's question.
Perfect. No, that's great. And obviously we'll look forward to providing our written comments. I think what's making it difficult for us to adjust our perspective is, and we're feeling like we're just repeating ourselves at this point, is we're not feeling the feedback loop on, well, is what we're saying, are we making progress? Is it resonating with people or not? I mean, certainly from the questions, I think some things are not, and that's fine. But the struggle we have is with the cadence of, you know, written comments and prompts and written comments and prompts. I find that, at least from my perspective, where we could be talking past one another, and I'm trying to find common ground with the questions. But with the next one, we were asked questions about the opportunity for us to earn a return in any given year, and that the framework, the overall comprehensive PBR framework, in our view, really has to be designed so that we have that opportunity. And again, we've highlighted a half a dozen or so deficiencies that wouldn't allow us to do that. So again, maybe putting you on the spot, for Claire or Tom or any of the other, you know, names on the screen, I'm really interested in reactions to what we said. Are there things that we're missing in the straw proposal that you see as providing us that opportunity that we don't see? Do you agree that we should have that opportunity in any given year, and that ultimately the PBR framework, you know, should have that opportunity or not? Any reactions would be helpful for us to know. And again, I don't know if it's appropriate for, you know, Peter or Pura staff. I'm not sure, but, you know, certainly I'd love to get the dialogue going and understand all perspectives. And again, what are we missing?
I mean, yeah, I'll say I don't think it's a controversial position for the OCC to say that, yeah, legally you guys have the opportunity to earn a fair and reasonable rate of return. It's in some Supreme Court
But in
case.
the framework, that's what I mean. If you take the
But-
straw proposal framework, is that, do you see in the shortcomings that we're identifying and trying to be very, clear on how we're identifying them, not to cause trouble or pick a fight, but to identify that we see this going in a bad way. We want it to work and we're concerned that it won't. So that's what I'm wondering is, again, just for others who have different perspectives, what am I missing?
I think
Sorry.
we're all, I mean, at a very high level, we're trying to create the right balance between, ensuring that legal obligation of ensuring your opportunity to earn is present, but also trying to create a system where there's continuous, incentive to not spend just to spend. And I think it's a tricky balance, and all of these different pieces sort of play into each other. So that I think, to your point, Doug, it's hard to react to one component without knowing, what other components are in place. It's a puzzle, right, to get to that right balance. I do think, and it kind of relates to the question I was going to ask about the K-bar mechanism, because that is an area, that could help provide some of that balance in terms of opportunity to earn. And you guys touched at a high level on Alberta and Mass, but I just was wondering if there were specifics, like how the different K-bars work in Alberta and Mass, and how does that impact the cost containment incentives that they create, and on the flip side, your opportunity, to earn.
That's great. No, I'm happy to talk about that. And that was actually the last question that I had. So maybe I can, the question being, how does this hit you? Because, the question, Tom, that you just asked UI in response to a capital tracker versus sort of the prior regime of having forward-looking multi-year rate plans and what would be the preference. And so I do have an opinion on that, but I think that, Claire, your question will help me to articulate how we're looking at it. And again, to the extent you're able to share your perspectives or just initial reactions, is very helpful to me. So our experience, again, is in Massachusetts. The idea was to set up a framework that provided a level of revenues that supported both ongoing operation and maintenance changes in our cost structure and capital. So initially in the 2017 rate case, the PBR factor was designed to accommodate both of those things, meaning we came out of that case with cast off rates that were set based on the rules in Massachusetts, and then annually the rate would change, and the rate would change based on a factor that was calibrated to reflect the average utilities cost trend, reflecting both cost changes in capital and O&M expenses. So although, and this is, I tried to say this before, although the initial cast off rate was set using very similar at least principles of, known and measurable changes and used and useful in service, those same principles apply. In the intervening rate years, the I-X was calibrated so that we'd get revenue support increments each year that were designed to give us an envelope of revenues under which to operate, not tied to any one activity, but so that we were incentivized to deploy our resources as efficiently as possible, whether capital or whether O&M. And I would say, although you get to that in a different place than Connecticut had historically done so, the idea was the same. We used a forward-looking test year and multi-year rate plan. At the end of the day, we had an envelope of revenues, and it was up to the utilities to run the business well. So that would mean that even if you had whatever, X number of capital investment in rates in that forward-looking test year, when you got to that point in time, if for whatever reason it was not appropriate to spend that level, you wouldn't. You'd spend less, but you'd use your resources elsewhere in the most efficient way. You have that same incentives because we're running the business. Money is fungible. We're running the business in the most efficient way. So the incentives are there. And then there were trap doors in the event things got out of whack. So having said all that, the initial framework was that there wasn't a K-bar. The I-X was calibrated to contemplate both capital and expense, and the X was negative. And we acknowledge that a negative X factor is a tough pill for regulators to swallow, for stakeholders to swallow. It's an awkward thing. It's difficult to explain to people. It sounds like you're approving a utility to be inefficient. And although that's not what it stands for, it's still, we get it, that's tough. So in the most recent iteration, in our most recent rate case, in 22, the department moved away from that and said, well, instead of a negative X factor, is there a different way to essentially get to the same place so that you're getting a revenue support for both capital and expense? Now comes the K-bar. My understanding is the K-bar in Massachusetts is the same, or at least structurally very similar to that which was approved in Alberta. And all that does is if we just think about our revenue requirement coming out of a case, you've got capital related elements and expense related elements. Effectively, what happens now is we have inflation on the expense related elements of our cost of service. And then we do is we say, okay, based on our historical level of spending, so it provides a natural cap based on our history, our historical actual capital additions inform the level of capital revenue support provided by capital under the K-bar. So we have inflation for O&M, and then we have an additional revenue stream or revenue support for capital that's capped basically at our historical level of spending. And so in that way, it's not a capital tracker. It's not to say if you spend X, you get Y in concurrent year in that way. It's saying you have a revenue level of revenue support that's it's tied to our actual experience, and it's supposed to be providing a cap so that we still have that incentive, but acknowledging that just inflation on the O&M part of our cost of service is insufficient for us to run the business in the way that we need to serve our customers, because the constraints in Massachusetts are very much like they are here. We have growing capital needs. And so in Massachusetts, the department acknowledges that that the K-bar offers a way to provide revenue support and retain those incentives. So it isn't the perception or the reality that you have a capital tracker, so you put $1 in, you get $1 back. We still need to run the business under the envelope that we get under the PBR framework in Massachusetts. So that's why in my mind, I think the combination of the PBR and the K-bar retains those incentive elements. And in the absence of having some framework that retains those incentive elements, you lose it all. And that's what I'm worried about. Meaning if we have a structure that we see as being set in a way designed to be insufficient, then, well, we can't do any of the things. We won't be able to stay out of a rate case. We won't be able to pursue those efficiencies. We will have to just file rate cases and update our rates because we can't cut the cost, which is our only other recourse when we're not able to earn a return.
Okay. So my understanding is Mass and Alberta are a little different. Mass is based on a rolling average of capital spending, and Alberta is based on a fixed period. And Kaya Rabine from RMI is on. You may, if you want to jump in, feel free. But we were just trying to decipher sort of the impact of those different particular models on utility spend.
That very well be, and I'm sure that Kaya, you're right. My recollection, well, in either case, but correct me if I have this wrong, because I know that the moving average was an element of the Mass DPU decision. I guess I had forgotten the intricacies or differences between the states, but the jurisdictions. In either case, you take your historical level, whether that would be at a fixed period of time, or in our case, it's a 5-year rolling average. You take that average and then you project it to rate year levels by the inflation factor. So I think the way that would work out, but Kaya, please again chime in, the difference between the two at the end of the day is really would come down to how much is the historical level of capital expenditures increases, the actuals, different than inflation. Because in the Alberta model, if it's set in a fixed period, you're still projecting that to rate year levels using inflation, sort of bringing it up to current day dollars, but with inflation. Whereas in the Massachusetts model, using a rolling average, the cap becomes informed both by inflation and recent trends in actual capital additions. But because it's a 5-year average, say our capital increased significantly last year, just pick a 20% increase last year. Well, the K-bar would only recognize 1/5 of that because it's a 5-year average and it's a rolling average. So it's still slow to catch up. And I think that was, if you read the department's decision approving the K-bar, that was really what was behind it, was that the Mass DPU was trying to establish a framework that acknowledges the increased level of spending for core distribution work and wanted to have a framework that wasn't overly restrictive Because again, Massachusetts had experience with capital trackers that were designed to be restrictive. So they were trying to retain, again, the incentives while not giving the utilities too much and having too much that it's not having those incentives. So I'll stop and Kaya, please react.
I think, I don't know. I mean, Claire, I don't know if that answered your question. I mean, I think that was helpful. I think that the question that we were wondering was your perspective on these different incremental capital funding options. And since there is between different possible mechanisms, that trade-off between having basically a funding mechanism that is relatively independent from your own cost decisions that you're making, and therefore sets a strong efficiency incentive, versus actually being something that tracks your capital spending needs closely. There's a trade-off, right? A capital tracker's on one side where basically everything you spend, if it's prudent, is recovered, and something like a pure inflation adjustment, or maybe with an X factor in there, would kind of be on the other side. And we were just wondering about the K-bar is a bit in the middle. And since there are some different designs between Alberta and Massachusetts, we're just curious for your views on that, or maybe if LEI would like to opine if they have some views on the impact and cost efficiency incentives.
No, that's a great question. I think this perhaps is where on the edges, UI and Eversource, we do have just slightly different perspectives. We have seen the detriment in Massachusetts of a capital tracker that's designed poorly. Conversely, here in Connecticut, we actually have a capital cost recovery mechanism. Folks, I'm sure know, that's in place as a result of the last settlement agreement. And it was actually designed, I think, for the point, Tom, or maybe it was Jacob, that someone was making, where historically, when we had forward-looking rate years, we would incorporate into that calculus a projection of capital additions. And if we spent less than that, well, you would over-recover for that one component of your cost of service. So the ESI, which is our capital tracker in Connecticut, came about to solve for that, where we set that level lower in base rates and then allowed for an adjustment for things above that. That's fallen, I would say, out of favor. A law was passed requiring that to go away at the time of our next rate case, that specific mechanism. So we're looking at it saying, I think just to your point, there's a way to do this that retains the incentives and the benefits of PBR, which is administrative efficiency as well. At least that's one of them, where we're given an envelope of revenues, and then we're required to go and perform. And we buy into that philosophy. Tell us what we need to do, tell us the targets, give us the resources we need to do, we'll do it. What we're worried about is we see it falling short by being overly restrictive. So I think as a framework, we fully support and think this can work without a pure capital tracker if it's properly calibrated to reflect our overall costs, and then we would go and perform. That's going to require a level of trust on both sides, because again, the utility then, hey, we may spend less than the capital forecast at the time this is said that we would. We might not spend that capital, and I think that's what you should want us to do if that's the most efficient deployment of our resources. Whereas under the prior paradigm, the concern is real, and it's what has been said, meaning, hey, we would set rates at a projected level of capital expenditures. We might not spend that, and then we would get scolded, for lack of a better term, the next time we came in. But if that wasn't the best way to spend our resources, would you want us to have spent that capital? And I think that's why there's a different way to build this, so that it doesn't have to be a pure capital tracker, as long as it's acknowledging, and whatever the framework we come up with is acknowledging, that rates in a given year should be reflecting reasonably our costs. And if they're designed to not reflect our cost structure, we will not be able to perform under PBR. We'll have to file a rate case. Long way of saying, we don't see the need to have a fully tracked capital cost recovery mechanism. That certainly can work, but I do think it gets away from some of the benefits of it, because you're basically having a half of a rate case every single year to review the prudency of those investments, or at least in theory you are. And I see Julia raised her hand. And if there are follow-ups, then I'm happy to keep talking. But I was also interested to the extent that either Kaya or maybe Tom or Claire, you can react to that if you're comfortable. How do you see the trade-offs? And again, it's specifically to the straw proposal that doesn't contemplate either. Is there something in what we have proposed that you react to as working better or different, or anything you can share would be very helpful to us.
I mean, I think I'll say we did file. I'll back up a little bit. That we did. I think this is in response to I think what you were talking before about Doug about the company's frustration about. I think you referenced when you were talking before about how it doesn't feel like the company is being heard or that we're moving forward. That you said that you feel like the company's repeating itself. My impression of the procedural sort of posture of this docket is that Pura, my read of the straw proposal is that the authority has heard the perspective of the companies and the OCC and other participants who have offered perspective. And I think even in the parts of the straw proposal that any given participant disagrees with the straw proposal, in my mind, does a pretty good job of noting the position advanced by a particular participant and explaining sort of where the straw proposal landed. I'll add, though, that we did file our own responses to the straw proposal, but my understanding, getting back to what I was saying a second ago, my understanding of where we're at sort of in this docket is that the straw proposal is a straw proposal. It's it is advancing the conversation forward. It's sort of saying this is what Pura staff and what the agency has sort of put together based on where we all are so far, and then we all had an opportunity to respond, and now here we are talking about it. So I don't know that. I hope I'm not wrong. I think from our perspective, we don't feel like this conversation's over or that's what we're hearing from Pura or from anyone else. I think the fact that we're having this conversation now and the fact that the company, put on your presentations today is indicative that everyone's still considering how best to make this process work.
Definitely. No, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that I think it's over, and we'll certainly continue to participate. I'm only just foreshadowing that we'll likely say a lot of the same things and whatever so that was, I guess, so not in the process though, but any reaction to the notion of a capital cost recovery mechanism versus a K-bar versus an I-X versus just inflation, or I guess any.
Yeah, well, I'll repeat myself probably here because I feel like I say this too much, but it so much depends on the details again. I mean, I think any of those models, I can see downsides and upsides to both. For instance, and this really isn't a comment specific to any particular company or anything that's happened in Connecticut, but take from a 10,000-foot view, if we're just talking about sort of rate making theory, I hear the company talking about, I hear the points made by both companies about the problem from the company's perspective of starting with a historical test year that can't be adjusted. And the problem with that is that there is a need, an inarguable need, I think, for incremental investment. We're talking about electric companies, and here we are in 2024. I don't think anyone disagrees that demand is increasing, but I think that depends on the assumption that historical investment has been the necessary minimum level of the necessary level that is sufficient, but no more than sufficient according to our statutory standards for the company to operate. And I think. And again, I say that not suggesting that isn't true or is true with respect to any given company, but I think that's something that's worth considering if you're designing a framework. Is that if the comment is that it's impossible for the company to add incremental investment if it isn't allowed to increase its level of investment from historical perspectives, I guess that's true if you're just talking about investment, but I think it's possible to also consider, well, maybe historical levels of spend have exceeded what was actually necessary. So maybe a system that isn't relying on a constant upward trend of spending that never backs down, maybe that system doesn't account for the possibility that there could be more guardrails on what's necessary. Whether those guardrails take the form of what's being proposed in the straw proposal or something else, I don't know. I'm just kind of putting that out there as an example of, I can't really sit here and say right now what the best option is, whether a capital funding mechanism, whether an Alberta model, K-bar, but just sort of raising that as something I've thought about today.
Yeah, I think because of the nature of the sort of puzzle we're putting together, it's hard to say specifically, one option is preferable to the other, depending on what other, guardrails, how we set going in rates, it's all, we're trying to look at it holistically. I think our written comments did sort of give a list of multiple options on how to get there. And Kaya, do you want to kind of run through some of those quickly?
Yeah, sure. I can just refresh everybody's memory. Yeah, so basically, mainly we remain concerned about the possibility of cost trackers applied to capital expenditures to weaken cost containment incentives. So we have some recommendations just focused on if a cost tracker is used, how you can kind of set that up in a way that keeps those cost containment incentives strong, and also about looking at different options. So the options that we offer just for peers consideration were to consider adopting a limited cost tracker, not broad-based, but limited, that focuses on specific policy priorities. So for example, like AMI expenditures could be one of those, or different types of specific beneficial electrification or other types of specific expenditures. And we recommended to consider reviewing Alberta's type 1 mechanism, which is one of their, it's not the KBAR, but it's their other incremental capital funding mechanism, if there's interest in exploring that possibility. We also recommended considering a comprehensive shared savings mechanism, and that is one of the mechanisms that we proposed in the other in REO2 and the other PBR docket. And we also had proposed in that, I think, no, maybe it was in this docket, now I'm mixing them up, but basically to adopt a set of cost tracker principles so that for any cost trackers that are adopted or carried over, that there's a regular review and consideration of how to design those in the best way possible. And then we recommended considering ways to set the allowed ROE carefully. In general, that obviously is not just about this docket, that's more a broad recommendation for the next rate case. And then we did also offer up a bit of a different idea, which was the potential of ratepayer-backed securitization for specific spending categories. So that was another thing we included just as an option for PURA to explore. But we didn't, in our comments either recommend here's the one thing or the two things that should be adopted, but rather that this is an area that deserves consideration, and there's a range of different possibilities that could be used. But again, as Claire said, it's this puzzle, the pieces do fit together and they influence each other, so it's hard to look at them in isolation.
Great, thank you. So I would just, and I'll stop talking, just to react to the last points made, and thank you, Kaya, for that overview. Trying to find a positive, but I don't think I'm searching too deep. I actually think there's probably more alignment in the principles than what we're saying, which is that I think, Tom, if I could paraphrase, but tell me if I'm wrong. Basically, what you're saying is that we shouldn't just assume that utilities need to spend what they've spent in the past or more than what they've spent in the past. Whatever the framework is, it should be calibrated to what they actually need to spend, no more and no less. I see heads nodding, and I would agree. And I think that's when we look at the straw proposal, and again, not trying to be difficult, we don't see that happening. We see decisions being made that will assume the opposite, that we are spending too much and we need to cut spending in order to be successful. And that's what scares us, that we don't see that as the case. So I would say as a principle, we certainly do agree that whatever the framework is, number one, I agree that all the pieces need to be taken in consideration together. Whatever the outcome is, it should be calibrated to set rates at a level that are designed to be no more, no less than the utility needs in order to have an opportunity, but not a guarantee to earn its return. So we would agree with that. And our concern is that things that are at this point being denied without even having the opportunity to present what you just said and convince you that, no, we need more than what we've had in the past to do all these things. That's the concern we have. But totally agree with the premise. We need to be able to make that showing before things are taken off the table. So I will stop talking. Thank you so much. And I really do appreciate the feedback and dialogue.
Ms. Freyer?
Thank you, Chairwoman. I just wanted to jump in. I know there was a comment, Claire, you had said the holistic approach was very important in the discussions we just heard from yourself, Tom, and Kaya. And I know Doug just also mentioned that you need to look at the pieces taken together. So I had a comment kind of following up on one of the broad agenda topics for discussion today, which is the financial modeling aspects. And I wanted, for purposes of stakeholder discussion, to get a feel about what pieces of the financial modeling would be most important to stakeholders, to OCC, to PURA, and whether that type of some of the modeling that was presented even today is useful, and what other aspects of modeling could be useful to try to dig in and empirically examine some of these theoretical concepts. Because I think theorizing about the Alberta model versus the Massachusetts model versus the Hawaii model, I think only gets us so far without being able to really understand how the pieces interact with each other. And the financial modeling does provide that. So I'm curious again, what other stakeholders think, whether PURA is anticipating to do its own financial modeling, whether that would be the forum for testing out these concepts. And please go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I've been hesitating because I don't want to, be I feel like I've already spoken too much. That there's plenty of other much smarter people on this call than I am. But I'm just, by financial modeling, what are you talking about? Setting the return on equity, or the X factor, or general, something more general than that?
So what I'm thinking, Tom, is that there are different financial tools and evidence-based tools, scientific tools to, for example, study what the potential X factor could be, what the, as you said, the ROE should be. But I'm thinking even more general, bigger picture, how all the pieces that are in the straw proposal or in other alternatives being proposed, how they can fit together. So I'm thinking much broader picture in line with how my colleague, Ms. Trinidad, talked about the Hawaii modeling that was done to evaluate how the various components of their revenue adjustment mechanism would or would not work together cohesively.
Ms. Fryer, you broke up a little bit, but I think we got the gist of your question. I'm not seeing anyone that is prepared to comment on your question today. So appreciate you posing it, and certainly folks are welcome to respond in writing. And I think that leaves us with one hand up, Mr. Hurwitz.
Thank you. And I may have missed a moment for this comment, but I'll offer it just in case. UI is certainly open to creative or alternative mechanisms for capital cost recovery. As Mr. Horton emphasized, the most important thing from our perspective is that we have a reasonable opportunity to recover our costs and earn a fair rate of return on and of invested capital. As we described in some of the earlier technical meetings in this particular reopener, we've made proposals and answered questions based on the experience Avangrid has in other jurisdictions that have used PBR type rate making models, including New York and Maine, but we are certainly open to further discussing how that might work specifically here in Connecticut. And just to touch on some of the concerns or comments we heard from Mr. Wheel about, how do we know that that historical level of investment is what the system really needed? I think some of the earlier sets of written comments that UI submitted in this proceeding described some of the enhanced types of documentation that we could provide and some of the guardrails that we might propose to make sure that everyone is kept whole under various rate-making proposals. And lastly, I'll just echo something that we heard from Mr. Horton, which is UI, like I imagine every electric distribution utility, invest what the system needs, and we're open to working with folks to make sure we all have a common language for proving just that. And I think we also have identified someone who might have some further context on the Handy-Whitman Index, if that would still be of interest. That is circling way back to a question from Mr. Kramer, but we have someone who can offer a little bit more context on that index, if that would be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. And just make sure I understand before we go back to that. I think Mr. Kramer's question earlier was about whether the company was proposing the Handy-Whitman Index in this proceeding, and if you are, why? Because and I think I see Mr. Kramer nodding along. So to your earlier point, certainly we know what the index is, so I don't think we need to be educated on the index, but rather if you are proposing it, why? And so if there's a response to that question, then I certainly don't think it's too late.
I understand. Okay. I think based on that, we might be okay. I don't want to lose out on potential insight from Mr. Lowry, but I think we might be okay then, if that was the context of.
Okay, I apologize. I'm not trying to chill the discussion, but I just want to make sure that I understood what the proposal was here.
Absolutely, and I think what we answered correctly, and we'll stand by what we offered. But would it be okay if, with that context, we gave Mr. Lowry an opportunity to contribute if
Sure.
he had something additional to share with that understanding?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
The reason I left my hand up was that I think part of the question was how the GDPPI growth compares to that of the Handy-Whitman Index. Let me start by saying that, the Handy-Whitman Index is specifically an index of electric utility construction costs. So it's more for a price index for capital spending. And there are other components of prices that are relevant for utility regulation, like labor price trends. For that purpose, you're more likely to use something like an employment cost index. Then you have to have some sort of a measure for material and service prices, but a lot of that nowadays is outsourced services, which are also very labor intensive. At all odds, the gross domestic product price index is well known to materially understate the growth in all of these inflation measures, because it is a measure of the output prices of the US economy and not an input price index. So the two are going to differ by the multi-factor productivity growth of the US economy. And we live in a country where productivity growth is very rapid. And so that's probably the biggest reason why the GDPPI tends to understate utility price inflation. And that's just one of the reasons why it's inappropriate to just have an inflation -0 escalator for revenue. Another thing you want is an escalator for growth in the number of customers served, consideration of the special CapEx needs in the service territory. So I was just trying to answer that part of the question, but while I'm on, I'll just give you a little color commentary about the K-bar. There was a question, a comment about, well, will the gross plan additions, say in the last 5 years, be appropriate to use as the basis for capital revenue escalation going forward? And the answer is, well, it depends if you're in an area where you're looking at 10 or 15 years of fairly high CapEx. In that event, yeah, it can be a decent marker for, to take the last 5 years as the basis for capital revenue growth in the next 5 or 10 years. And this was an insight that one of the members of the Alberta Utilities Commission had. He was a guy who had a PhD in economics from the University of Toronto. And he said, well, why don't you just set the CapEx budget for five years based on the recent historical CapEx? And that's where the idea of a K-bar came from, is that it was sort of a fixed amount, although adjusted for inflation. And we wrote an article last year in the Electricity Journal about the effect of implementing the K-bar in Alberta. And the result was a very notable increase in the productivity growth of capital by the Alberta gas and electric power distributors under this K-bar mechanism.
Thank you. And for the record, Mr. Lowry, can you just tell me who you're with?
Oh, yeah, I'm the president of Pacific Economics Group, and I'm doing some work for Avangrid in this proceeding.
Okay, thank you. All right, very good. I think that about wraps up our agenda for the day. Just reviewing next steps, which are available in the docket. I think we hinted at them earlier. There's likely a written comments prompt coming up. We have another technical meeting, our 8th technical meeting, which is on the calendar as well. So just encourage folks to stay tuned into the docket schedule for any updates that are made in the docket. So I want to thank everyone for their robust engagement today, for the presentations, answering the questions, and for the commentary. So with that, we have reached the end of our agenda, and we are going to adjourn until next time. Thank you very much.